All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Finding the Source. We are, of course, at a new date and a new time going forward this winter and this spring to start the new year. And tonight, we have, of course, myself, Dr. Ashley Lusky. I'm the Assistant Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, and Peter Carmichael, Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. And to kick off our return to Finding the Source for the new year, we are joined by Dr. Andy Lang, who is Associate Professor of History at Mississippi State University in Starkville, Mississippi. And tonight we're going to be talking with Andy about his new book, A Contest of Civilizations, Exposing the Crisis of American Exceptionalism in the Civil War Era. It just came out, fresh off the press, hot off the press, in the Littlefield series from UNC Press. So, Andy, we are delighted to have you here with us tonight to kick off our new series of Finding the Source.
We've had a very long intermission. We've been off for a little bit more than a month. Gettysburg College had a nice, long, extended break. Andy, I don't know how long. How long did you get off for a break this year?
I had 7.5 weeks. It was great.
Good God. You know, I think I made a tactical mistake here. I have now let, of course, the general public, or I should say confirm what they suspect of the academic world, how soft these people must be.
Yeah.
Weeks off, we get God. I guess maybe we were pushing something like that as well. But I think we need to assure our audiences that we were at it first early in the morning, researching, writing,
Yes.
right, going right at it every day.
That's right.
But that is, it did sort of feel like almost like a summer recess almost. But it was wonderful to get an opportunity to get back to research and writing. Because that time away from classes affords us that moment. Before we get into things here, can we just quickly mention Andy's first book? And Andy, you've got the book right behind you. I do as well.
Yeah.
My dust jacket cover. Ashley will laugh about this. Ashley knows that I'm very hard on books. Ashley's office is right next to mine, and I think that she keeps a close eye on me when I went to borrow books, knowing that when I return them, they usually look like they've been used. And so, Andy, do you have your book there behind you?
I do, yes.
Yeah. So it's an LSU book, and it is worth mentioning because it won a notable prize in the field of Civil War history. So, Andy, could you just tell us a little bit about the prize that you won for In the Wake of War and what what this book is about as well?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So, In the Wake of War is my first book based on my doctoral dissertation at Rice University. I finished at Rice in 2013, and In the Wake of War came out in 2017. And it's basically about how Union soldiers in the American Civil War and Reconstruction understood and experienced military occupation, and how they understood it and experienced it actually in a very odd and unusual way. It did not conform to what they imagined to be what I call the citizen soldier ideal, the notion that common citizens lay down their civilian trades and join their brothers in arms, as it were, to defend the national interest in times of crisis, with the assumption that their service would be quick, temporary, and would be in the service of some kind of active engagement toward the national interest, in this case, preserving the Union. But what they found, 1/3 of all Union soldiers who served in the conflict actually served behind the lines as occupying forces, garrisoning forces, police forces, engaging civilians, engaging not the formal armies, not the formal Confederate armies, but informal, irregular guerrillas, waging a kind of chaotic counterinsurgency that few had ever imagined and most didn't understand. And so this sense of, I don't want to call it disillusion, but it kind of was a disillusion, translated much more broadly into Reconstruction when white loyal citizens encountered the problem and necessity of using what they considered to be a large standing army to enforce social, political, and racial ends of Reconstruction, a notion which conflicted with many citizens' conceptions of what a republic is and isn't. The paradox of all this, of course, is that another main cast of characters in the book are USCT soldiers, free-born African Americans and formerly enslaved African American men who came not to see the Army in such skeptical terms as white soldiers, but instead as a tool of their own liberation, a tool of force, and a tool of emancipation and equality. But to make a complex story short, white loyal citizens opted for a demobilized, anti-militaristic republic that did not ultimately use the power of force to effect and occasion lasting civil equality.
So how many, you said, what was the percentage of Union soldiers that did garrison duty for much of their military service?
Yeah, it's about 1/3 of all Union armies.
So probably the most stunning conclusion from this book is that a significant number of Union soldiers actually gained weight during the Civil War, right? They're sitting around in their camps, sitting around in their garrisons.
Yeah, so, I mean, I joke with my students. You know, a lot of these soldiers grumbled about sitting in places like New Orleans, which, you know, to me, either serving on the Virginia front or serving in New Orleans seems like a pretty easy decision on my part. But, you know, they didn't ask me.
The other thing that before we get to the book at hand is that Andy received the Watson Brown Prize, which is a very prestigious prize in the field of Civil War history. It's a prestigious prize. I'm going to be a little crass here, so pardon me, but it's a prize of $50,000. Andy was so jubilant. He's mostly a pretty restrained fellow. So jubilant that in the moment of victory, he said to me, invite me to CWI to speak. Beers for everyone, not just the faculty, Ashley, for the attendees as well. That's part of our new marketing campaign, Andy. So when you're there, you're saddle up to the bar, probably I would say the Gettysburg Hotel, and we're looking forward to celebrating the Watson Brown Prize with you.
I look forward to it. I will say that I might drive my new minivan that I bought for the family with the prize money. So,
well, you are in the company of John Hennessy. John Hennessy, his first book, yes, it is his first book, Return to Bull Run, right, which is still in print. University of Oklahoma Press is the publisher now, but it was, I think, originally published by Simon & Schuster. And John Hennessy said that with his royalties, not a reward, his royalties, he also got a minivan for the kids.
Very good.
I don't, I can barely buy a bicycle with my royalties. All I can do. So, all right, I'm so sorry, Ashley. Ashley probably thinks, we Ashley and I get together and we're like, okay. I said, Ashley, we're going to start this series with a document. That's what we're going to do. Every time I go off on something else, and I never ever follow our game plan. And she, of course, is very patient. So, Ashley, I'm so sorry. I will turn it back to you, and so we can get started and talking about Contest of Civilization.
Sure. So, Andy, obviously, this recent book of yours has a lot of threads from your previous book in it, which we're, of course, going to get to later in the conversation. But before we get into that and the nature of military occupation and how Americans responded to that, can you just give us a little bit of background as to what the inspiration was to take up this project, why you felt it was necessary to take on such a large project as this one, which is really, it's quite impressive considering it's such a beautiful synthesis of the antebellum Civil War and Reconstruction years with this nuanced argument woven in between. So what was it that drove you to take up this project?
Well, when the series editors, Gary Gallagher and Mike Parrish, inquire if you're interested, the answer is typically yes. Of course, I was interested. I didn't know what I was getting into in 2015 when they probed my interest. But that was the genesis of this, and it was born of conversations that I'd long had with Gary and Mike. And Mike had been working on American exceptionalism in the Civil War era for a long time. And so I had a pretty good grasp because they both worked with me on the first book, so I had a good grasp of what the vision of this was to be. But I probably didn't appreciate just the extent to which this topic can just go in all kinds of directions. And so the last 5 years has been just immersing myself in this concept of American exceptionalism and the notion of civilization, that it's a word, a term, an idea, a concept that appears, I found, all throughout the primary source documentation. It's a word that ubiquitous numbers of Americans employed to describe their nation within the world. And as the title suggests, there is not a consensus on what civilization, or what we would call today American exceptionalism, means. They all, I'm generalizing here, but there was a generally shared notion that there was something unique, even according to something destined about the American Union. But that's pretty much where the consensus ended. And the contest or the conflicts began. And so my job over the last 5 years was to unpack and then bring together in some coherent fashion, and I hope it is coherent, this contest of civilizations, as you said, from the early 19th century all the way to, I think my latest source is 1880. And this is the product.
And you make very clear, of course, that this isn't a book that's set out to either prove American exceptionalism or disprove it, but rather to understand how 19th century Americans understood the concept and then utilized that to different means. The ramifications of different beliefs in exceptionalism in causing the war and how the war was waged, and then, of course, how Reconstruction plays out as well. And you touched upon just now the idea, the very strong commitment that 19th century Americans had to these words, which maybe to us in the 21st century don't carry nearly as much weight. Exceptionalism, obviously, there's been a lot of talk about that, especially recently, but ideas of union, and you use the term radical internationalization, and the idea of, Republican democracy or democratic republic. Can you kind of explain how these ideas, these singular terms, what the power, the sway of those ideas had upon 19th century Americans, and how that played into their contesting ideas of exceptionalism?
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's indeed what my task was here. So when we speak of American exceptionalism, you're absolutely right. I tried to make painfully clear at the very beginning that I am not trying to verify the arguments that 19th century contemporaries were making. I never intended to do this, but I was inspired by an essay that I came across in the early 90s, published by a very prominent historian, intellectual American historian, Michael Kamen, who said that it doesn't matter to us whether or not the 19th century U.S. was exceptional or not. Those debates are immaterial, because what our job is to recognize that American exceptionalism, as he said, is as old as the nation itself as an idea, and equally important, has played an integral part in the society's sense of its own identity. And he's right about that. And so what I tried to do is to show how 19th century Americans believed that they populated a democratic republic that sat atop, and that's a key image here, that sat atop a world of anti-democratic monarchies, nobilities, aristocracies, a world of hierarchy and undue privilege, a world that had attempted to democratize from the French Revolution through Latin American revolutions, through the European democratic revolutions of 1848, but in most cases devolved into counter-revolutions, tyranny, anti-democratic politics. And so the task of being an American was to conserve or preserve this special nation, presumably within this anti-democratic world. And we all know what the overwhelming paradox of this conviction was, and that is that there are differing notions of exceptionalism, of civilization to different groups of people. And I think the best way to go about looking at this, I didn't really make this point as clear in the book as I would like. We always realize what we should have said in a book after the book is out. And so what I'm about to say here is actually not in the book, but it summarizes it, I think, in a good way. In my opinion, the prime exponent of 19th century American exceptionalism was Abraham Lincoln. While there are many people who understood the concept, I think, equally as well as Lincoln was able to explain it and locate its inherent paradoxes in profound ways. Probably Frederick Douglass joined Lincoln in that regard. So for Lincoln, the 19th century United States was based on two propositions, a word that he used in his 1838 Lyceum Address, and then again in the 1863 Gettysburg Address. At the Lyceum Address, Lincoln said that one of the propositions of American life was to demonstrate whether a free common citizenry was capable of self-government, whereas in most of the world, self-government had proven a failure. So can we or can we not, Lincoln would argue, fulfill the mandates of a democratic society? That's the first proposition. The second proposition comes from the first sentence in the Gettysburg Address that we all know so well. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And so there's Lincoln locating a more spiritual sense of America's place in the world, the notion of human equality. And we can talk about what that term meant later on. 19th century Americans defined it in considerably different ways than we do. But there it is. They're the twin pillars: self-government and the notion that that nation states are built on the supremacy of individual dignity, that the individual human matters in a society. Well, as we know, that's going to pose a massive problem for the 19th century, because if you think about the paradox inherent in this, the very nature of self-government and the very way the constitutional system was built actually permitted a sizable group of Americans to undermine, to challenge, to reject Lincoln's second proposition of equality. Self-government, in some ways, in many ways, built the United States into the world's largest slaveholding power at a time when most of the Western world was engaged in some forms of emancipation, some forms of free labor. So here we see seeds being planted about what is the purpose of self-government? What does equality mean? For whom does it apply? For whom does it not apply? And here we see, go ahead.
So I want to just push back just a little bit, if you don't
Sure.
mind. This idea of Lincoln and drawing Lincoln's belief in equality, and you give a nod to the Gettysburg Address, which the Adams County Chamber of Commerce certainly appreciates. And but are you certain about this? Wouldn't it be maybe more accurate to say that what Lincoln believed in was in the quality of opportunity?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Not equality. He didn't believe
Correct.
that all people were equal, but he believed that everyone should have the right to earn the fruits of her or his labor. But he really
That's
just his labor, and it pretty much meant. Well, he did say time and time again that he thought that African Americans were also entitled to the fruits of their labor as well. So I think that distinction is a critical one, and it's unfortunately lost on too many people who increasingly want to see the cause of the North as the cause for human equality. And so, again, it is, I think, a misunderstanding of Lincoln to suggest that he is a man who believes in equality. He doesn't believe in equality; he believes in equality of opportunity. So,
Sure.
could you help us?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to unpack that a little bit later on, and I agree entirely. And this is one of the many contests of American civilization, is the very definition and limit of equality, because you have within a very vibrant African American intellectual community, particularly in the North, that takes the meaning of equality in its most natural, literal sense, a definition that conflicts in many respects with the way Lincoln applied it. Here, I think that we can see stark differences in Lincoln's thought with someone like Frederick Douglass. Look at his July 5th, 1852 speech, What to the Negro is the 4th of July,
Right.
in which Douglass says, yeah, there's a lot that's unique about the United States. And the reason the United States is unique is because it balances claims to liberty and equality alongside inequality. And he says there's no nation in the world like this. And so we can, he says you, he doesn't say we, he says you to his fellow white Northerners, you can continue to commit these sins, these violations of basic human rights, while you continue to proclaim living in an exceptional republic. But it's not unique. It is false, he says, to the past, present, and future. And so what is equality? What is liberty? What is union? We haven't even talked yet. Go ahead.
I'm going to go back to Douglass. So do you think Douglass was right, though? Was he right ultimately in saying that the U.S., or actually referring to the North, that it really is not any different than what was happening across the globe? He is spot on in pointing out what you would call the paradox or the tension or the contradiction between the promise of social equality and the fact that it is dependent upon the servitude or enslavement of African Americans. He's spot on there. But was there still not differences and distinctions between what was happening, not just, I would say, in the North, but also in the South? With the promise of social mobility, is that something that other nations are putting their stake in, that they truly believe in? So that is my question.
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's a good point, because Douglass does offer, toward the end of the speech, a way out to the sin of slavery and racial inequality, and he locates it in the nation's founding documents. He points to the Declaration and he points to the Constitution, what he calls, quote, a glorious liberty document. And he says, looking at these in their literal form, word for word, this is the way out of this paradox, but it's up to you, he points to white Northerners, to uphold the true meaning of these documents. He would argue equality is not simply about equality of opportunity, but natural basic human rights. And he says the reason I'm talking about this is because you wrote it down. It's right there in the founding documents, the very documents that distinguish this nation from, he would argue, the nations of the world.
And Angie, I think you make that point very nicely in terms of summing up why Reconstruction proves to be so problematic, is that emancipation and ultimately, so-called equality was always a means to an end. It wasn't the end in and of itself, a humanitarian ideal for the vast majority of Americans. It was the way to preserve the Union. It was the way to preserve stability once Reconstruction happened. And then, of course, you're pitting the over-centralized state and military occupation to ensure equality against the localized, more self-government that kind of shies away from equality, which is ultimately what happens in the post-Reconstruction years. You obviously spend a lot of your scholarly time on military history and kind of showing us the importance of doing good military history and how that shapes how we understand broader issues related to the Civil War era, politics, culture, society. And military history plays a key role in this study as well. It intertwines very, very much so with Americans' ideas of exceptionalism, what they justified as necessary in military situations to justify a means to an end, to secure this more perfect union and democracy as the last best hope of democratic government. Can you kind of unpack for us how military history, kind of more broadly defined today, when there's been so much talk about military history and whether it's still useful, what does good military history look like? Can you kind of unpack for us how you use military history to get at these broader ideas that are so central to the long Civil War era?
Yeah. This is if there's been one element of my career, it's been this question: how to do military history. I don't claim to have the answer. I have my method, at least my understanding up to this point. But I don't think that we can, and I think that most of our colleagues would agree with this, but I don't think we can engage in any Civil War study without taking military institutions and affairs seriously, simply because the people at the time did, and the way the era evolved was predicated and contingent largely upon those institutions and affairs. Lincoln said in the second inaugural, the progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends. I think Confederates would have agreed with that. Unionists would have agreed with that. The fate of emancipation certainly hinged on what happened on the battlefield and in military campaigns. But more specifically, the reason, the longest chapter in this book is on the military conduct of the war. And the reason that's the case is because every aspect of the era, from politics to culture to society to diplomacy to the ending of the war into Reconstruction, all hinged on and was dependent upon military institutions and military events. And so what I tried to do is, at least in that chapter, is look at the war from the vantage point of military practitioners, from high-ranking officers to civilian commanders to several common soldiers, to see through their eyes and see through their words how Union or Confederate independence or emancipation was filtered directly through military events. We can never divorce military history from anything else. And I find this to be quite vexing, only in the sense that every now and then we get these stories in the popular press, decrying the fate of military history. There was one just this week in Bloomberg making this claim that military history is no longer supported at institutions of higher learning, which comes as news to me because my institution has supported the writing of 3 books on military history.
Yeah, I'd say your school is the exception. I'd say you're the exception. I think Research Ones, I don't think that it has the support that it should. And I won't name names, but you're in a great place.
Well, I consider myself fortunate in that regard.
And beyond that, the Mississippi State program, graduate program, you guys have, as I was doing some research on you recently, what a lineup you all have there. Some fantastic scholars, great teachers. Ann Marshall, another Southern historian, is there. Jim Geeson, who does Civil War history. Not a bad basketball player, I might add. He played.
That's right.
Not so bad. And so you guys have a great place. You're very fortunate. I just want to, I'm sorry I keep interrupting. I'm not that sorry, actually. But I'm going to ask a quick question about the waging of war and how you describe it in your book. And it seems to me that you stress that there is a moderation in Union policy, a moderation in how it is executed, not just by generals, but also on the ground as well. You are very clear that there is ample evidence of atrocities, of war crimes. And you also, I think, make the point that Aaron Sheehan Dean makes, that this war was in part contained because enslaved people never engaged in the kind of insurrection that would have maybe resembled what had occurred in Haiti. So now here's the question. And then I hope you maybe bring this to Reconstruction as well.
Okay.
I read this chapter. I've always stressed to my students that this moderation that we see in terms of Union policy, that maybe one wants to call it exceptional, fine, but we'll put that word aside. And as I think looking at our past, there's something that I see as admirable. That restraint, that recognition that what was happening on the grounds had an impact on the political goal or political end of this war, and that if it got outside the boundaries too much in terms of how people were waging war, that political objective, that it would be in jeopardy. I'm almost there to the question. Here it is. But now after I read this, I think, you know what? The moderation was actually a problem. That it's the moderation during the war that enabled in the post-war period for that slaveholding ruling class to dust themselves off and reconstitute themselves in another power. And so, Andy, I'd like you to comment on that. And ready? I know you're going to hate this, I'm afraid, but I want you to do it. I want you to do a little counterfactual for us.
Okay.
I want you to think about the war, and I want you to imagine what could or should have been done that could have maybe not just preserved the peace, but resulted in true radical revolutionary change.
Yeah, I mean, that's the age-old question of Reconstruction literature. This was probably the. Go ahead, sorry.
So start with the war. When you think about the modern policies that were employed, what's your take on that? Was that a mistake? Should there have been a harsher war? Should they really? I say to my students, and I take a line from Eugene Genovese, he comes up with Plan X, right? Remember, Ashley, what Plan X is? Plan X of all the Reconstruction plans. Plan X, Genovese said, was to take all the former slaveholders, line them up, and shoot them. Let's treat this like a real revolution, right? So I'm asking you, do you see in the moderation of Union war policy that is the seed of the problems that will blossom in Reconstruction?
So I'm going to start by kind of unpacking a bit how I'm using the concept of moderation, because I think that Aaron's book, The Calculus of Violence, just does such a remarkable job of showing the inherent irony in the way the Civil War was conducted militarily. Because he argues, and I agree entirely, I try to make the same point, that both sides envisioned and subscribed to notions of a restrained, moderate war. And yet we know that this is the bloodiest war in American history. There is rampant guerrilla violence. There are episodes of atrocity, episodes of violations of the laws of war. And so how do we square contemporaries' claims of fighting a restrained and moderate contest with what actually happens? The way I try to deal with this is to argue that moderation meant adhering to the laws of war, adhering to the rules of war. But what the rules of war and the laws of war permitted were vast escalations in conduct. And so take the Lieber Code of 1863, for example, a code that at once limits what Union armies can do in the field, but also at the same time gives incredible leeway and license to those same armies in conducting war against the Confederacy, its home front, its social institutions, but it's legal, right?
Yeah.
That's at least how they argued or justified. That's the key word, justified their conduct. Anything that happened outside the bounds of those laws or those parameters was considered to be unlawful. But that's how we get an incredibly violent and an incredibly bloody war, while also seeing how contemporaries themselves said it's restrained. Another example of this, and Aaron makes this point really well. The Confederacy could have waged a true rebellion of sorts, but instead they claim to be, I don't think they were, but they claim to be a legitimate nation among the community of nations. Well, what does that entail? What does that demand of a national people? Formal military institutions, formal laws, right? A rejection, at least on paper. There are exceptions, of course, to guerrilla warfare. This is how contemporaries argued that they were waging a civilized, quote unquote, and a just war. But the nature of escalation, particularly for Union armies, gets us to what Sherman called the hard hand of war, the title of Mark Grimsley's famous book. And yet there's another paradox embedded in this, and it's the paradox that you brought up, Pete, and that is, should Union armies have waged an even harder war? Should they have waged a total war so as to ensure that the resurrection of the old slaveholding class never returned to power? I mean, in 2021, yeah, of course. Of course, the answer is yes, period. But as I tell my students, it is It's easy for us to see that. And it's also easy, painfully easy, for the 4.5 million enslaved people who would have depended on and benefited from this kind of total war against the Confederacy to have made that argument. The problem is that a vast majority of white loyal citizens believed, I think, that they could not transgress Lincoln's warning that he articulated in December 1861, that this contest shall not deteriorate into a violent and remorseless revolutionary struggle. Well, what does revolutionary in this context mean? For most white loyal citizens, it would mean a revolution against the very nature of democracy itself, right? Transforming a democratic republic into something entirely different. The painful reality of that, though, is that that very revolution would have guaranteed, or at least presumed, I should say, a lasting social, civil, and political equality. And so people, the majority of citizens, and this is the power of a majority, to be sure, determined that a revolution against American life could not come at the expense of a stable union. And it was easier in the mid-19th century to trade lasting, real equality for a lasting union. And the United States was not going to emerge into a 19th century militaristic garrison state to serve a regional racial agenda. And that's the gross irony of the whole period. Frederick Douglass, I begin the epilogue with Frederick Douglass's 1880 speech comparing West India emancipation to American emancipation. And this is the point he makes. He says the solution to our problem in 1880 is incredibly simple, and that is powerful force in the service of human rights. But most Americans were not willing to, not willing to entertain what that kind of force would entail.
Well, before we get to Ashley's question on Reconstruction, I just wanted to show the book that we have been referencing. This is Aaron Chiandine's The Calculus of Violence. And as Andy pointed out, it's an outstanding book. And I think it is one that complicates the arguments of Mark Grimsley that Andy also mentioned. That book is entitled The Hard Hand of War. Aaron Chiandine calculates. Sorry, horrible glare. And I'll just conclude before I head to Ashley. I think, Andy, you make a very good point, is that the notion that one could annihilate Confederate society, and that in the wake of that there could be a biracial democracy, or that there could be true revolutionary change. That is asking Northerners at that moment to look to the future with a degree of clarity and precision that is beyond any historical actor in that moment. The idea or notion that you would do Plan X, as Genovese, he used that, of course, as a way to juxtapose the more conservative plans for Reconstruction. But the idea that this move beyond moderation, that Northerners should have and could have embarked upon that, is, I think, a bridge too far for most people. That's not because of any inherent racism, I believe. I don't think that's because of any conservatism. It's the simple fact, I think, that anyone would agree. The possibility of anarchy, that's more than what anyone can stomach, and that's a real possibility if you begin to destroy, dismantle, annihilate is the best word, Southern society.
I think, oh, go ahead, Ashley.
No, I mean, I would just follow up on that with, what you discussed about Grant's, personal opinions, looking back at the end of his life about should we have been more strict during Reconstruction? Should the federal government have kept the Southern states at bay, for that 10-year period or whatever he suggested, that, they're basically separated from the rest of the country. They're disbarred from politics. There is a standing military occupation, and his ideals, of course, conflicted very much so with Lincoln's vision for what Reconstruction should look like, that he, of course, never got to see play out. And, I think what you say in your book and what Pete just kind of reaffirmed is that I think it behooves us to look a little bit more closely at these issues of, I think we're so quick to say, well, those people were just so racist back then that they weren't committed to equality, they weren't committed to civil rights, all of that. But there was this powerful stronghold that, again, from a 21st century perspective on ideas of unionism and this 19th century view of exceptionalism, that people were terrified of losing that. And again, when we try to view the war, as being rooted, in its core as this battle over human equality, we lose sight again of that historical perspective of 19th century Americans, the power of union, the power of preserving the last best hope of democratic government. And I think that's where you're blending in an internationalist perspective really helps us to understand Americans were looking at themselves from the inside, of course, but also looking at how the world would view them, what their moral responsibility was as Americans during this time to show other countries that were experiencing these revolutions, to show, Latin America, and to show Spain and France and China, all these countries that are having these major issues, these cycles of tyranny and despotism, and then anarchy, and then tyranny comes in again to bring things back into control. Americans are desperately afraid of that. And then, of course, they're looking backwards to pre-revolutionary times, thinking about the despotism that they saw being imposed upon them by Great Britain, and not wanting to go back to that state as well with an overly centralized state. So I think your emphasis on internationalization, on how other countries would view America, but is how Americans look at themselves compared to other countries, and seeing what's going on, the Mexicanization that you talk about, which maybe you could kind of unpack that term for us as well, that people were desperately afraid of in the wake of the Civil War, as being a very valid reason for why people shied away from continuing that military occupation, continuing that centralized state, even to ensure the long-term progress toward equality that they saw as being so essential to maintaining union. Right in front of their face, was this conflict going on all over the world over these same issues that they couldn't ignore. And that internationalist perspective is so important that you bring up.
Yeah, you spoke of Mexicanization, and here I need to give credit to Greg Downs, because he has a just marvelous essay in either the 2012 or 2013 issue of the American Historical Review called The Mexicanization of American Politics. And I drew off of his work in this because it's just such a wonderful essay dealing with this very concept. Mexicanization was a term that moderate white Republicans used, not just during Reconstruction, but the term dates back. I found it as early as the 1850s. I'm sure it goes back further than that. But it's the imagined sense that Latin American nations, Central American nations, exemplified the fate of Mexico, an incredibly unstable republic that could not maintain its own territorial or constitutional integrity. It was always under revolution and counter-revolution. The rule of law didn't mean anything, blah, blah, blah. White Americans used this to argue two things. One, look at the weak and failed attempt at, quote, Mexican nations, that's what they would have said, who failed at democracy, their Catholic heritage, their militaristic tendencies, their inferiority from race or class, whatever. I mean, it's a very racialized argument. They're using that to juxtapose the supposed stability of the United States and its own democracy. And so by the time when we get to Reconstruction, when each election in the 1870s on the local, state, and ultimately, presumably, the national level in 1876 comes increasingly and perpetually under conflict, in which Democrats use force and violence to reject election results, to storm courthouses and state houses, to prevent the Republican legislature from meeting. This is Mexicanization taking place before terrified moderate white Republicans. And what were to happen if this Mexicanization, so-called, bled over into national politics? What if the Congress was, I know that we can't conceive of this today, but what if the Congress was stormed with mob violence? This was a palpable fear to these people, and it led to, I mean, this is simplifying the story, but there's one way to combat this, and it's with force, national military force. But is that then what a republic looks like? How a republic works? And so the trade-off is home rule, white Southerners regaining control and, quote, stability. I mean, it's disgusting, but that was the trade-off in the South. Yeah.
Just two quick things here, and I know that we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of politics to today, but I think the parallel just has to be made.
Yeah, of course.
Of Mexicanization. I heard time and time again by people on both sides of the aisle, including some people on the left, and referencing what happened at the Capitol, in the storming of that building. That doesn't happen here.
Right.
That happens in Latin America.
Right. Oh, I know. Yep.
Eastern Europe as well. But
Yep.
this is what we do here. And so that strong sense of exceptionalism is very much with us. Yep. And it still has, I think, a racialized edge to it. I'm also struck that and again, I'm hoping that I'm not getting my facts wrong, but it's my understanding that one reason why there was not sufficient force outside the Capitol, despite the fact that there was ample evidence that there could be violence, but there was the optics, right, of having lots of troops and National Guard as well. And I get it. I understand it because, of course, we see ourselves, and I think justifiably so, as a nation that hasn't always had to rely on brute force. But now here's the big question, Andy, and it's a big question that does certainly relate to how Americans today conceive of democracy. So when I look at your book and I see that moderation has caused, in many cases, dysfunction, violence. In fact, it's the moderates that have allowed reactionaries sometimes to prevail. What about how Americans see democracy today, right? We continue to harangue that we just need to come together. We need to just embrace each other. Everyone keeps referring to Lincoln's second inaugural. If we'll just basically be friends and be nice. And that's what we hear time and time again. That message you hear today, Andy, and the findings from your book, what does that tell us about how we as a people understand the nature of democracy?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer this. You're right. I've seen a lot of, and it's the last paragraph of Lincoln's second inaugural that people have been pointing to, where I think, I mean, if we're going to read Lincoln on this score, we may as well go to the Lyceum address first, in which Lincoln's talking about the implications of rejecting the rule of law in favor of mob violence. We could go to Lincoln's first inaugural address, where he lays out very clearly that the whole purpose of democratic Republican governance is what he calls acquiescence to the terms of the system, even before the first vote is cast. That the whole point of being a citizen, we have an obligation. We have our own individual and collective obligation to uphold the system, and if we don't, then the system's meaningless.
But Andy,
and so,
would you just quickly, would you not say that that's the problem with Lincoln? And to this day, it's not the problem with Lincoln, it's our problem in how we use Lincoln.
Yeah.
What you've just said, and you've said it beautifully, and I'm so impressed by how there's a specificity and a concreteness in terms of your referencing what historical actors have said, including Lincoln. It's really, like I said, it's very impressive. But isn't the problem that we extract those words and come under this false notion that this is how democracy has always functioned? Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting that the storming of the Capitol is just a natural consequence of democracy. But I am suggesting to you is that the words are getting in the way of what democracy is. It is a rough and tumble and almost always a violent business.
That's
and
right.
in God's name, can't we be honest with ourselves so that will then not be so shocked and horrified when we see something like we did at the Capitol. Be shocked and be horrified, but don't think it's exceptional, right? Because
no, of course. No, I think that that's right. This is, we want to talk about paradoxes. One of the big themes of the book is trying to deal with 19th century Americans claiming to be the world's most civilized nation, a stable nation, a peaceful nation. And yet, as we know from our own colleagues and the scholarship that they produce, violence is rampant all over the 19th century landscape. And it's one of the things that Tocqueville pointed out about what made the United States unique is just the, as you said, the rough and tumble nature of American life. And it's bizarre. And, I don't fully understand or know why it is that they and then we convince ourselves of these narratives, because that's what exceptionalism is. It is a narrative. And I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
It's fascinating how, again, Lincoln is so inspiring. And at the same time, I would argue that he doesn't intentionally deceive us. But again, his words are so compelling that we think that somehow that it governed people then, it has governed people since then. And all of a sudden, we've lost touch with those words. We've lost touch with those statements. But as you well know, and Ashley knows, that you heard that same message before the Civil War, Northerners and Southerners saying there was bequeathed to us an obligation to the founders. And somehow that got screwed up. And it just happened, right? It's just the politicians now, they're blowing it for us, when in fact, the very same issues that they were confronting after Lincoln's election were issues that were there, front and center, ever since the founding of the country. It is, It's bizarre. We have a very false, very simple, very naive understanding of democracy. I would say, as a people today.
You mentioned Southerners right before the Civil War. One of the only groups of people we've not talked about.
That's right.
Are Confederates, and I know we might be running short on time, but there's a very distinct sense of slaveholding and Confederate exceptionalism. I mean, one of the main reasons, at least as I argue in this book, that there's a Civil War is because enough, although they were a political minority, enough powerful slaveholders believed by 1860 that slavery as the centerpiece of civilization, in their words, was under threat by an ascendant Republican administration. And, we're also living through a moment in which the lost cause is still commands such powerful sway in our popular culture, even though that's just remarkably depressing. And I think it would do lost causers well to go back and read what the Confederate founders said about what it is that they were doing. They were very open, explicit, and proud about creating what they said was the world's first nation dedicated exclusively, explicitly to racial subordination, racial hierarchy, limited privilege, and that they were outright rejecting the principles of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, Alexander Stephens said that equality is located in the Declaration of Independence, and we reject it. And our new system is based in complete opposition to that. And so you want to talk of the contest of civilizations, that's it right there. And this is one reason why Lincoln framed the preservation of the Union as such a critical thing. It's not just about democratic governance, equality of opportunity. It's about the very notion of Americanism. If another nation exists on the basis of claiming itself to be the true heir of the founding generation, to be the true nature of what the United States used to be, then you have competing notions of American exceptionalism in the world. One of those has to die. One of those has to cease to exist, Lincoln said. And if the Confederacy wins, then everything that we claim to be unique and destined in the world could very well be proven false. And so, I mean, there was a lot at stake in this.
Andy, I think I would also add on to that. I mean, it's not only the very clear paradox of different interpretations of who is the heir of the revolution, or the revolutionary ideals, and who is the true, proponent of exceptionalism. But there's this insistence then in the 19th century, and even I think still today, on the purity of exceptionalism, that we have to be all one way or we have to be nothing at all. And what your book does nicely is hold out the idea that nations can be exceptional in many ways compared to other nations, yet at the same time be deeply flawed. And I think that insistence on this 100% purity is also what fueled so much of those tensions in the 19th century, and continues so much of the tensions now, is that there will always be this contest of different interpretations of what exceptionalism means, and what true constitutionalism means. But then also this insistence that it has to be 100% pure, that has gotten in the way historically and even into the present.
Well, and this actually may be a good way to answer Pete's question about our current crisis of democracy. It's simply untenable to have a system in which one side considers their political opponents to be an existential threat. That's what happened in the 19th century. There was actually good reason for that. I think that the anti-slavery abolitionist faction did believe that slaveholders posed an existential threat, both to the promise of liberty and the promise of human rights. And slaveholders argued that the Republican Party did as well. But even in our current moment, when how do you function and navigate within a system in which that tension still exists? I don't know. And this is the problem. You hear calls for unity.
But here's the profound difference. And that is that in 1860, I'll state the obvious, right? We have a Republican Party that represents Northern interest. That economic and political power is based upon wage labor, right? The South is based on slave labor. You have two very different political economies. They're compatible in terms of making money for each other, but political economies, they are very different. Today, we don't even have anything remotely close to it. You had the President of the United States who before the election said that if he lost, it would not be a legitimate election. And then after the election, he insisted upon that and his party followed him. Now, that is unheard of, and I think in American political history that at least I'm aware of. And so the idea that somehow as American people, that ideologically and politically we're at odds, hell, I don't see it. But what I do see is a demagogue who's been allowed to have his perch and no one questioned him in his party, and that is, again, just absolutely, I think, unthinkable. But I want to push a little bit about Southerners. We just have a little bit of time here. You mentioned Alexander Stephens, and he's often quoted as the person who insisted, and very honestly and correctly, that the Confederate nation was a nation dedicated to inequality based upon racial subordination. Got it. But Andy, you stop, I think, a little bit short here, possibly. He believed, as did other Southerners, that liberty was dependent upon that. And as you well know, and I think some of the audience knows, is that there was a prediction, and a dire one, that a wage labor society ultimately would collapse upon itself. And so I say this to the audience. I am not defending slaveholders, trust me. But I do want you to comment on the fact, and again, maybe you deal with it in the book and I just didn't get to it. When I look at the late 19th century, they had a point, because you and we have focused so much on Black citizenship, as we should, but my God, the exploitation, the persecution of laboring classes in the Northeast, of immigrant populations, and that their subjugation was racialized. What comes out of capitalism, what has come out of feudalism, are racial moralities. It is there. And so my point, again, is when you think about the Southern message, and please, again, I want to stress, I'm not suggesting that they had a message that was the correct one. It was not. But they did have a warning. And I want you to comment on that warning. Do they have a point that we've missed?
Well, I'll answer like this. the most prominent spokesperson for this argument was George Fitzhugh, whose book, The Sociology for the South, among many other points that he makes, he makes this argument, but he does so in a really interesting and pretty devious way. And he frames it as you've described. But the way he does it is he says that what they have achieved, what white Southern slaveholders had achieved in the South, was the perfection of labor and class relations, that slavery was a buffer to the turbulent, uncertain demands of a modern market economy that exploits white citizens. And what Fitzhugh said is that this, you almost read Fitzhugh as an end of history type author, that the 19th century South, and you can fast forward a little bit, the Confederacy had reached the end of history in the sense that they had achieved in their minds, a peaceful solution to the problem of labor in the 19th century world. Fitzhugh argues that enslaved people do not have to compete for employment. They do not have to compete for wages. They do not have to worry about where their next meal or shelter is coming from. That is predetermined for them. He also argues that slavery fashions a stable class hierarchy in which non-slaveholding whites benefit from the slaveholding, or from the stability that a slaveholding society provides. This is incredibly romantic because, as we know, slavery is at its root a brutishly horrific, violent system that does the opposite of exactly what Fitzhugh said. This is how they rationalize it and justify it to themselves. And I think one of the ways that they can make such an easy leap into secession and independent nation building, because if they think that they have achieved the peaceful solution to the problem of labor, race, class, social structure, if they think that they've achieved that, then why wouldn't a new independent nation based exactly on these attributes not work? Why wouldn't it work? That's the hubris that they were bringing to all of this.
Captured Fitzhugh there well, and I'm not going to let you go on this point though. But their prediction is that laboring classes, that they would ultimately take to the streets because they would be exploited so viciously, and that the violence that we see in the late 19th century in the North is exactly what they envision. And so my point is that when we look at the 19th century, and when we look at your book as well, that our focus on Reconstruction is understandable, and our focus on the ultimate abandonment of the plight of African Americans is where our focus should be. However, we should also recognize what was happening in terms of the loss of liberty and freedom for working people, immigrant people, whose subjugation was absolutely racialized, And I think that is, we are so not focused on the Southern story that we might be losing track of what was happening in the Northeast as well. And we might actually remind ourselves that the losers of this war, who were detestable in so many ways, and as you said so nicely about the lost cause, which there's nothing redeemable about it. However, those people were pretty damn smart. And it wasn't just Fitzhugh, it was many others who said, watch out what capitalism will do in a democratic society.
No, I mean, it's a good point, and I'll confess that I didn't address that part of the story even remotely in the book. It was already long enough, but I think that by focusing on that, it only would have enhanced the points I was trying to make even more. One of my graduate students actually called me out on this. I let them read the page proofs in one of my seminars last fall. And he said, all right, so 19th century Americans were really skeptical of using military force to uphold civil rights and African American rights in the South. The federal government was very willing to use military force in putting down labor strikes not too long after Reconstruction. And he's absolutely right. And I think the reasons for this for this dichotomy are somewhat obvious. I mean, the race question looms large in the reasons why the government would or would not use force. That can't be underestimated, but that's one of the many paradoxes that just riddle this entire long era.
All right, Ashley, do you have anything to wrap us up?
I don't think so, not for tonight. Just to say thank you, Andy, for joining us tonight, and for kicking off this New Year's programming of Finding the Source. It was such a provocative discussion. Hopefully our audience found it to be the same. And I will say too, we're switching our schedule not only to Wednesday nights instead of afternoons this winter and spring, but we're also going every other week. So our next segment will be in 2 weeks, Wednesday, February 17th. We'll be going live with Deirdre Cooper Owens to talk about her book, Medical Bondage, which is about medical advances and basically experimentation when it came to the use of African-American bodies, especially female bodies, to advance medical science and specifically female medical science. So we'll be switching gears a little bit, but that's in 2 weeks, February 17th.
I have to say, the one revelation, Andy, that is slightly disappointing today is that you took all your money and bought a minivan. So what we're asking, I think Ashley will agree, that when you come to speak at CWI, that must be one hell of a minivan. I mean,
well, I didn't use the entire check to buy a minivan. To be sure.
You can't backpedal now, man. You can bring that van up, and we're going to do some good touring around the battlefield.
Yeah, good.
I bet it's got some nice plush seats. Probably has a little, I don't know, a little fridge in there. We can't put beer in there, right? It's on National Park Service grounds.
That's right. But I can probably scrounge up some money to buy you a beer.
Absolutely. Andy, man, this is a fantastic book. I want to say one more time, might have some young people out there, I hope, who are watching this and who might be thinking about graduate school. I can't say enough good things about Andy as a historian. He's a good guy as well. As I tell my students, man, when you go off to grad school, yeah, you want to work with someone who's got, a reputation, a good reputation in the field, but you also want to work with someone who is a really good and decent person who's going to be there for you. And Andy is just that person. So you're thinking about going off for grad school, Mississippi State would be certainly a place to consider. It's great seeing you, man. Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
I hardly see Ashley because of this COVID. Hell, as a crow flies, we're what, maybe a mile away from each other? Not even.
Probably less than that.
Well, we're hoping that by April that Ashley and I can actually maybe do a show and be side by side and go back.
Right.
Nice.
Ashley, thank you so much as well.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Take care.
Take care.